Before we begin, I'd like to clear up a few things about the title, as it is slightly hyperbolized. First, Penda was not the King of England. England during his time was not a unified kingdom, but was split into several smaller realms. But he was the king of one of these kingdoms. Second, Penda was not the last pagan king. There was a Jutish king on the Isle of Wight called Arwold who lasted 30 years after Penda's death, but he's not that interesting, so he barely counts. There's also the Viking kings who invaded later, but as they aren't Anglo-Saxon, I don't count them. Penda is the last major pagan king of England who had many successful military campaigns when paganism was dying out. He ensured that paganism in Britain wouldn't die out quite as easy as people might think, and made his kingdom one of the greatest in Britain. Let's have a look, shall we? Not much is known about Penda's younger years, but what is known is that he was one of 12 sons born to Penda of Mercia, and he was of the Aisling dynasty, a line that is said to track its lineage back to Woden, one of the Anglo-Saxon gods heavily inspired and influenced by the Norse god Odin. One of the major sources we have on Penda, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, tracks Penda's lineage back to Woden. The quote is on screen now. The date of Penda's ascension to the throne is also unknown, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle declares that Penda came to the throne in the year 626, was 50 years old on the date of his ascension, and ruled for 30 years. This year, Penda began to reign, and reigned 30 winters. He had seen 50 winters when he began to reign. This would put his death in the year 656, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle puts his death in the year 655. This year, Penda was slain at Wingfield, and 30 royal personages with him, some of whom were kings. It is a small discrepancy, but a discrepancy nonetheless. So maybe he didn't rule for 30 years exactly, or was in the 30th year of his reign. Penda being 80 when he died, and 50 when he became king, is also doubtful because of the age of his kid. In particular, according to the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, Penda's son Wulfhere was still a child 3 years after Penda's death. 3 years after King Penda's death, the old Mother Mercian race, Imin, Aether, and Eadbert, rebelled against King Oswo and set up as their king Wulfhere, Penda's young son. The common way to solve these conflicting accounts is that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle meant to say that Penda was 50 at the time of his death, so he would have been 20 when he came to power, and this does solve most of the issues. Regardless, Penda came to power in 626 and almost immediately jumped into a war. In the late 620s or early 630s, either way only a few years after Penda's crowning, the king of Gwynedd, Cadwallon ap Cadfan, was at war with Edwin of Northumbria, the most powerful king of Britain at the time. Cadwallon was unsuccessful at first, but he formed an alliance with Penda, and the Welsh, Mercian and Northumbrian forces met at the Battle of Hatfield Chase on the 12th of October 633. Beda again has the details for us, and describes the battle in the following quote. A fierce battle was fought on the plain called Hothfeld, and Edwin was killed on 12th of October in the year of our Lord 633, in his 48th year. The whole of his army was either slain or scattered. In this war too, one of his sons, Osfrith, a warlike youth, fell before him, while the other, Eadfrith, was compelled to desert to King Penda. So Penda's first battle was against a numerically superior foe. Mercia and Gwynedd are estimated to have had about 1,800 troops, and Northumbria 3,000. And they absolutely devastated the enemy, killing the enemy king, one of his sons, and capturing the other. That's a pretty good start, I must say. Both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Ecclesiastical History of the English People go on to describe the war after Hatfield Chase, and they both describe Cadwallon and Penda ravaging Northumbria. While this wouldn't surprise me, we must keep in mind that both of these sources were created by Christians. Penda was a pagan, so both of these sources have reason to hyperbolize the barbarism of Penda and Cadwallon. Here are some quotes from their sources. At this time there was a great slaughter, both of the church and of the people of Northumbria, one of the perpetrators being a heathen and the other a barbarian who was even more cruel than the heathen. Now, Penda and the whole Mercian race were idolaters and ignorant of the name of Christ, but Cadwalla, although a Christian by name and profession, was nevertheless a barbarian in heart and disposition, and spared neither women nor innocent children. With bestial cruelty he put all to death by torture, and for a long time raged through all their land, meaning to wipe out the whole English nation from the land of Britain. Nor did he pay any respect to the Christian religion, which had sprung up among them. The head of King Edwin was brought to York and afterwards placed in the church of the Apostle St. Peter. After this, Cadwalla and Penda went and ravaged all the land of the Northumbrians. Although both accounts mention Penda, his involvement in this is still uncertain. Penda may have withdrawn from the war shortly after the Battle of Hatfield Chase, as he wasn't present at the Battle of Heavenfield a year later that saw the defeat and death of Cadwallon. It's very possible that Penda took his elevated status due to his victory at Hatfield Chase to consolidate his power at home, but whatever he did, he took no active part for the rest of the war. After the Battle of Heavenfield and Northumbria's victory over Cadwallon, Northumbria was ruled by Oswald of Bernicia. Penda's activities during this time are obscure, but it's clear that Northumbria and Mercia did not like each other. It's likely that Penda acknowledged Oswald's supremacy in some manner, but Penda was also likely a substantial obstacle in Northumbrian influence and hegemony south of the Humber. Higham clarifies this for us in The Convert Kings, Power and Religious Affiliations in Early Anglo-Saxon England. One factor which sustains a maximalist interpretation of Penda's role during Oswald's over-kingship is the apparent failure of Bernician Christianity to penetrate the central Midlands. If the Mercian court long anticipated a collision with Oswald, it was fundamental to their preparations that they excluded the Bernician cult, with its capacity to reinforce subordination to Oswald and undermine their own sacred kingship. Had Oswald's control of Mercia been as complete as has been suggested by some modern commentators, he might have been expected to have established Scottish clerics there. So Penda probably paid Northumbria some kind of homage, but Northumbria's control over them wasn't that great because they remained pagan, something a Christian king in the 600s wouldn't stand for. Penda also made war on the East Angles during this time, killing both their king Egric and their previous king, King Sigebert, who had been dragged out of his monastical retirement. The date of this battle is uncertain, with some sources placing it as early as 635, but there's also evidence that places it after 640. Regardless of the date, we have an account of the battle from Beda. It happened that the nation of the Mercians under King Penda made war on the East Angles, who finding themselves no match for their enemy, entreated Sigebert to go with them to battle, to encourage the soldiers. He was unwilling and refused, upon which they drew him against his will out of the monastery and carried him to the army, hoping that the soldiers would be less afraid and less disposed to flee in the presence of one who had formerly been an active and distinguished commander. But he, still mindful of his profession, surrounded as he was by a royal army, would carry nothing in his hand but a wand, and was killed with King Egric, and the pagans pressing on, all their army was either slaughtered or dispersed. Now, I hate to spoil this for you, but Northumbria and Mercia are going to go to war at some point, so it's entirely possible that this war, which Penda started, mind you, convinced Oswald that Penda's ever-growing ambition and strength needed to be defeated to secure Northumbrian dominance over the south of England, and this tension is about to come to a head in the Battle of Mazerfield, a crucial battle that will decide the fate of both Mercia and Northumbria. The cause for the war between Northumbria and Mercia is unknown, but as we saw in the last segment, they didn't really need a reason, do they? The traditional location of the battlefield is Oswestry, in modern-day Shropshire. At the time, though, this is thought to have been under the control of the Kingdom of Powys, one of Northumbria's enemies, indicating that Oswald was on the offensive. As you may have guessed, Powys is a Welsh kingdom that was allied to Penda. Penda apparently was consistently allied to the Welsh. We have no details of the actual battle, unfortunately, only the aftermath. As you can imagine, though, the highly Christian sources are highly biased in favour of Oswald and against Penda, as Penda was a pagan. In fact, Oswald became a saint and martyr after his death. I looked him up briefly, and his feast day is the same day as my birthday, the 5th of August, which is neat. Anyway, both Beda and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mention this conflict, although Beda goes into more detail. Here are the accounts. This year, Oswald, King of the Northumbrians, was slain by Penda, King of the Southumbrians, at Merfield on the 5th day of August, and his body was buried at Bardney. His holiness and miracles were afterwards displayed on manifold occasions throughout this island, and his hands remain still uncorrupted at Barnburg. Oswald was killed in a great battle by the same pagan nation and pagan king of the Mercians, who had slain his predecessor Edwin at a place called in the English tongue Mazerfield. How great his faith was toward God, and how remarkable his devotion has been made evident by miracles even after his death. For in the place where he was killed by the pagans fighting for his country, sick men and cattle are frequently healed to this day. As you can tell from his quotes, Oswald was killed in the battle, but after his death his body was cut into pieces and his arms and head were mounted on poles, which were retrieved a year later by Oswo, his brother and successor. As you can imagine, this battle has been highly propagandized by the later Christian writers, and the Historia Brittonum even claims that Penda won through diabolical agency. Fancy words for what's basically witchcraft. See it for yourself. He fought the Battle of Cockboy, in which fell Ewa, son of Pibba, his brother, King of the Mercians, and Oswald, King of the Northmen, and he gained the victory by diabolical agency. He was not baptized and never believed in God. If you're confused by the name, the Battle of Cockboy, that's what the English sources refer to the Battle of Mazerfield for some reason. It's a different name for the same battle. This source also mentions Penda's brother, Ewa, and even calls him the King of the Mercians. The situation between Penda and Ewa is unclear, but co-kingships weren't uncommon in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, or Ewa ruled the northern Mercians and Penda ruled the south. Either way, with the death of his brother, Penda loses an important rival, allowing him to consolidate authority over all of the Mercians. The battle was a crushing defeat for Northumbria. Their king was killed and he lost 800 out of their 1,000 men, while Penda lost 700 men, 600 of which were Welsh tribesmen, out of a 3,200 strong force. The defeat also broke the power of Northumbria, with Deira, the southern part of Northumbria, declaring its own king, while Bernicia to the north was ruled by Oswo, Oswo's brother that I briefly mentioned earlier. Frank Stenton, in his book Anglo-Saxon England, explains Penda's position after the Battle of Mazerfield pretty well. Oswald's fall left Penda the most formidable king in England. There is no evidence that he ever became, or even tried to become, the lord of all the other kings of southern England, but none of them can have been his equal in reputation, and in many battles none of them ever defeated him. Now's a good chance to take a step back and look at where Penda is. He's killed 2 Northumbrian kings, subjugated the East Angles, broken the power of Northumbria, and become the most powerful and prestigious king in England. He's not doing too badly, is he? The Northumbrian defeat at Mazerfield weakened their influence basically everywhere, and this includes with the West Saxons. In 642, the same year as Mazerfield, the West Saxons declared a new king, Kenwell, and he was married to Penda's sister, but he repudiated her in favour of another wife. As a result, Penda drove Kenwell into exile in East Anglia in 645, and he would remain in exile for 3 years before finally regaining power. D.P. Kirby lays the situation out quite nicely in his book, The Earliest English Kings. The still pagan Kenwell was already within the Mercian orbit to the extent of having married Penda's sister, but, emboldened perhaps by an increase of territory under his control, he repudiated her and married another. Penda's response was to expel Kenwell, vividly demonstrating thereby the strength of his position along the valley of the Upper Thames, and Kenwell spent 3 years in exile among the East Angles, who were also subject to Mercian pressure, and among whom he was converted to Christianity. In 654, the East Anglian king Anna, the king who had harboured Kenwell, was killed in battle by Penda, and was succeeded by his brother Aethelhere. Why Penda declared war against the East Angles is unknown, although D.P. Kirby believes he has the answer. He attacked the Eastern Angles between 649/650 and 652, and expelled King Anna, whose unexpected return temporarily checked the Mercian advance, though only until 654 or 655, when Penda invaded East Anglian territory again, and this time slew him. It is possible that he now established his brother, Aethelhere, in his place, to judge from Aethelhere's presence in Penda's army at the Wynwade, if not as a dependent ruler, at least as an ally. So, at least according to Kirby, Penda attacked the East Angles to gain, if not a subject, then an ally. During this time, Penda also waged war against Northumbria once again, now controlled by Oswo and Bernicia. Beda gives us an account of this war. The hostile army of the Mercians, under the command of Penda, cruelly ravaged the country of the Northumbrians far and near, even to the royal city. Not being able to take it by storm by siege, he endeavoured to burn it down, and having pulled down all the villages in the neighbourhood of the city, he brought thither an immense quantity of beams, rafters, partitions, wattles, and thatch. Wherewith he encompassed the place to a great height on the land side, and when he found the wind favourable, he set fire to it and attempted to burn the town. At that time, the most reverend Bishop Aidan, who was dwelling in the Isle of Farne, when he saw the flames of fire and the smoke, he carried by the wind rising with the city walls, he is said to have lifted up his eyes and hands to heaven, and cried with tears, "Behold, Lord, how great evil is wrought by Penda. These words were hardly uttered when the wind immediately veered from the city, drove back the flames upon those who had kindled them, so that some being hurt and all afraid, they forebode any further attempts against the city, which they perceived to be protected by the hand of God. It probably didn't happen like that, but whatever happened, Penda was unable to take the city and was forced to withdraw. There's also no given date for this war, but it would have to be before 651, as the bishop mentioned in Beda's account. Bishop Aidan of Lindisfarne died in August 651. Penda, not being one to be put off for long, came back for a second attack on the area, while later, once again recorded by Beda. It happened some years later that Penda, king of the Mercians, coming into these parts of a hostile army, destroyed all he could with fire and sword, and the village where the bishop died, along with the church, was burnt down. There are no recorded battles between Northumbria and Mercia during the second attack, except for one that we will get to in a minute. The lack of attempting to meet Penda in battle may have been because Oswo felt that he was too weak to defeat him, and I can't blame him for thinking that, given Penda's military history. There may have also been a religious component to this, which Higham describes for us. Oswo seems to have consistently avoided military confrontation, while Penda emphasised the efficacy of his gods by successful campaigns against each and every one of his Christian neighbours. It was Penda, therefore, who acquired a preeminent reputation as a god-protected warrior king. Before we get into the last segment, I want to briefly talk about Penda's relationship with Christianity and his Christian neighbours. Now, I wouldn't begrudge you for thinking that all of Penda's neighbours hated him due to all the war he's been declaring, but that doesn't seem to be entirely the case. Penda's daughter, Sinbur, married Oswo's son, Alfrith, and Penda's son, Peda, married one of Oswo's daughters, Alflaid, and in particular, this second marriage brings us to Christianity. Peda's marriage would culminate with his own baptism and conversion to Christianity, and in fact, Penda was surprisingly tolerant of Christianity, despite his own beliefs. Quite curiously, he seems to have disliked impiety rather than Christianity, regardless of the religion of the impious. Beda has an interesting passage for us on this. Nor did King Penda obstruct the preaching of the word among his people, the Mercians, if any were willing to hear it, but on the contrary, he hated and despised those whom he perceived not perform the works of faith, when they had once received the faith, saying they were contemptible and wretched who did not obey their God in whom they believed. The conversion of his own son in the presence of Christian missionaries in Mercia can be interpreted in two ways. The first is that it's an example of Penda's tolerance, where the other is that it could be a successful attempt from Oswo to increase his influence in Mercia. Regardless of how you interpret it, I just wanted to quickly address the question of faith. And with that, the stage is set for Penda's final military campaign. In 655, Penda invaded Bernicia, at the time ruled by Oswo, who was king of both Northumbria and Bernicia, with a sizable force of 30 warbands and 30 royal or noble commanders. He was joined by Cadafal ap Cynfedwa of Gwynedd. I know I can't pronounce Welsh names, I am sorry. He was a long-standing Welsh ally, and Aethelheir of East Anglia, who, if you remember, Penda had placed on the throne. He was to receive support from Aethelwald, the king of Deira, whose land is traditionally made up part of the larger kingdom of Northumbria, but Oswo had struggled to exert his influence over the smaller kingdom. The causes of the war are unknown, but considering their history, Northumbria and Mercia don't really need a reason to fight each other, do they? Regardless of the reasons, Penda besieged Oswo at Oda, a city in the north of Bernicia, although to my knowledge the location hasn't yet been 100% confirmed. What happened next is a little bit of a mystery, as Beda and the Historia Brittonum give conflicting reports, but I don't need to show you two quotes as Stenton gives us both accounts. Beda states that Penda had 30 legions with him on this expedition, and mentions incidentally that Aethelheir, king of the East Angles, was present in the army. Nennius, who preserved a confusing tradition of the war, brings out the important fact that Penda was accompanied by many British princes, Cadafal of Gwynedd among them. According to Beda, Oswo, reduced to the last extremity, tried to buy peace from Penda with a great treasure, which was refused. According to Nennius, Oswo, who was besieged in a fortress called Odow, surrendered all the treasures in that place to Penda, who then distributed them among his British allies. These statements cannot be reconciled. So, while Penda was besieging Oswo in his city, Oswo at least offered Penda a great sum of gold and treasure in return for peace. Whether Penda accepted this, but then continued the siege after distributing the tribute to his allies, or if he just refused the offer of treasure, is unknown. Personally though, I believe that Penda did accept this offer as tribute, as soon after his army moved south again, potentially returning home. To our knowledge, there's no reason for Penda to do this. His forces, combined with his allies, far outnumber Oswo's, unless, of course, he had just received a vast amount of gold and treasure, and there was no longer any point in destroying Ido, as everything of value in the city had been given to him peacefully. Still, that's just a personal theory of mine. Regardless of why Penda abandoned his siege and his army moved south, before they could return home though, they had to fight a great battle near the river Wynwade. There is no modern river going by this name, but it's common theory that it was one of the tributaries of the Humber, or possibly Cockbeck, both of which flow through Leeds where the battle was roughly fought. The night before the battle though, Penda's forces were weakened by desertions, specifically from his allies. Catgabael, king of Gwynedot, rising up in the night, escaped together with his army. King Oswald's son, Odilwald, during the battle, he withdrew and awaited the event in a place of safety. The names are a little confusing, but Catgabael and Odilwald are Cadafael of Gwynedd and Aethelwald of East Anglia respectively. Penda's allies that I mentioned earlier. They're just called something different for some reason. Weakened by desertions, the Mercians were defeated, Penda was killed and his army was routed, many of whom drowned in their retreat due to the river Wynwade being bloated from recent heavy rains. The engagement began, the Pagans were put to flight or killed, the 30 royal commanders who had come to Penda's assistance were almost all of them slain, among whom was Aethelhere, king of the East Angles. The battle was fought near the river Wynwade, which then, owing to the great rains, was in flood, and had overflowed its banks so that many more were drowned in the flight than destroyed in battle by the sword. And that's it, I'm afraid. I'm sorry I couldn't end on a more dramatic note, but we don't know enough about the battle to frame it in any particular way. After Penda's death, he was succeeded by his son Peda, who ruled the southern Mercians while the north was controlled by Oswo. Penda's dynasty, the Islings, would remain in power of Mercia for some time, until Ecgfrith, the great-great-great-grandson of Ewa, Penda's brother, died, and the crown of Mercia passed to another family. And that's the story of Penda of Mercia, the last pagan king of Britain, who beat up basically all of his neighbours, stopped Northumbrian dominance across Britain, established Mercian control and influence across much of the Isle, and probably sent a message to the Christians that their god is not as powerful as they think he is. Unfortunately for us though, we have no surviving records from him, or any of his allies, only from those who vehemently hated him. Beda, who I have quoted numerous times for this video, gives us the most complete account of Penda, and his record is also the closest to which Penda lived, but he also hated him. I feel that Stenton sums this up quite nicely when he says, Penda was the enemy of every Northumbrian king who tried to bring the people of southern England under his lordship. He was himself a great fighting king, the kind most honoured in Germanic saga, the lord of many princes, and the leader of a vast retinue attracted to his service by his success and generosity. Many stories must have been told about his dealings with other kings, but none of them have survived. His wars can only be described from the standpoint of his enemies, and the stages by which he came to power are unknown. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like and subscribe for more, and leave a suggestion in the comments if you want me to cover something. If you're interested in my sources, in the description there will be ISBN numbers, links to purchase the more modern sources, and links to websites that have translated versions of the more ancient sources. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you soon.